The capture of Mount Suribachi marked a crucial turning point in the battle, eliminating the Japanese observation post that had directed artillery fire. Across the invasion beaches, however, the celebration was brief. 2/3 of the island remained under enemy control, and the most difficult fighting lay ahead. The Marines now faced the challenge of advancing across Iwo Jima's central plateau, where Kurabayashi had prepared his most formidable defenses in terrain that offered even fewer advantages to the attacking Americans. The advance across Iwo Jima's central plateau began on February 26th and immediately revealed why General Kurabayashi had chosen this terrain for his primary defensive line. Unlike the steep slopes of Mount Suribachi, the plateau offered little natural cover for advancing Marines, while providing the Japanese defenders with interlocking fields of fire from carefully concealed positions built into the volcanic rock itself. Major General Keller Rocky's 5th Marine Division faced the most challenging sector, where the Japanese had constructed a network of mutually supporting strongpoints that could only be reduced through costly frontal assaults. Each pillbox, cave, and bunker had to be approached individually, often requiring multiple attempts before Marine assault teams could get close enough to use explosives, flamethrowers, or grenades effectively. Corporal Anthony D'Amato led his demolition team forward through a landscape that resembled the surface of an alien planet. Twisted metal, shattered volcanic rock, and the debris of war covered every square yard of ground, while the constant smell of sulfur reminded the Marines that they were fighting on an active volcano. The enemy's defensive positions seemed to emerge from the earth itself, perfectly camouflaged and positioned to achieve maximum defensive effect. "There's another one at 2 o'clock, whispered Private Bobby Martinez, spotting the almost invisible slit of a machine gun embrasure carved into a volcanic ridge. The Japanese position commanded a perfect view of the open ground the Marines needed to cross, and previous attempts to flank it had failed due to supporting fire from other concealed positions. The battle for each strong point followed a deadly pattern that cost American lives with mechanical precision. Artillery and naval gunfire would pound suspected positions for hours, only to have the Japanese emerge from deep tunnels. Once the barrage lifted, Marine infantry would advance under covering fire, only to be pinned down by automatic weapons fire from multiple directions. Flamethrower teams would crawl forward under extreme danger to reach close enough range to assault the position directly. According to official military historical records compiled by the Marine Corps' Historical Division, the fighting across the plateau represented some of the most intense small unit combat in American military history. Individual battles for single cave positions sometimes lasted for days, with Marines and Japanese soldiers fighting at ranges measured in yards rather than hundreds of yards. First Lieutenant William Henderson coordinated close air support missions, calling in Marine Corsair fighter bombers to attack Japanese positions with bombs, rockets, and napalm. However, the enemy's underground positions proved largely immune to air attack, and the close proximity of American and Japanese forces often prevented the use of heavy firepower. Without risking friendly casualties, the psychological toll on the Marines was enormous. Unlike previous Pacific battles where enemy resistance would gradually weaken over time, Kurabayashi's defenders seemed to fight with undiminished intensity. Regardless of casualties or tactical situation, every cave cleared might be reoccupied during the night, forcing Marines to fight for the same ground repeatedly in a grinding war of attrition that favored the defenders. Medical corpsmen like Navy Hospital Corpsman Second Class George Phillips faced impossible conditions while treating wounded Marines under fire. The volcanic rock made it nearly impossible to dig proper foxholes or aid stations, forcing medical personnel to work in the open while exposed to enemy fire. The evacuation of wounded Marines across the open plateau required extraordinary courage from stretcher bearers who faced the same dangers as frontline infantry. March 5th marked the beginning of what Marines would remember as the bloodiest phase of the Iwo Jima campaign, the assault on a complex of Japanese defenses that earned the grim nickname Hell's Kitchen. Located in the island's northern sector, this area contained the most sophisticated defensive positions Kurabayashi's engineers had constructed during their months of preparation. Colonel Howard Kenyon's 9th Marine Regiment faced defenses that had been carved directly into Iwo Jima's volcanic bedrock, creating a three-dimensional maze of tunnels, caves, and firing positions connected by underground passages. The Japanese could move reinforcements and ammunition between positions without exposing themselves to American fire, while maintaining constant pressure on the advancing Marines from multiple directions simultaneously. Staff Sergeant Frank Caldwell's rifle platoon had been reduced to 18 men after 2 weeks of continuous combat, but they continued to advance against positions that seemed impossible to assault. The volcanic terrain channeled Marine attacks into predetermined killing zones, where Japanese machine guns, mortars, and rifles could concentrate their fire with devastating effect. "We're gonna need more demolitions," Sarge called out Private Tommy O'Malley as his squad encountered another steel-reinforced concrete bunker built into a volcanic ridge. The Japanese had used the months before the invasion to import cement, steel, and heavy construction equipment, creating fortifications that rivaled anything built on the European continent. The fighting in Hell's Kitchen required Marines to master new tactics developed specifically for this unique battlefield. Traditional Marine Corps' doctrine emphasized speed and aggressive assault, but Iwo Jima demanded methodical, coordinated attacks where infantry engineers, flamethrower teams, and artillery worked together to reduce each position individually. Sergeant Major Daniel O'Brien coordinated resupply operations under constant enemy fire, ensuring that forward units received ammunition, water, and medical supplies despite the challenging terrain and persistent Japanese harassment. The volcanic sand made vehicle movement extremely difficult, forcing most supplies to be carried forward by hand across ground that remained under enemy observation. As documented in contemporary military reports and post-war historical analysis, the Japanese defenders demonstrated remarkable tactical flexibility in their defensive operations. Rather than fighting static battles from fixed positions, they conducted coordinated counterattacks, infiltration operations, and harassment missions that kept the Marines under constant pressure even in supposedly secure areas. Captain Joseph Martinez led a company-sized attack against a Japanese strongpoint called the Amphitheater, a natural depression in the volcanic rock that the enemy had converted into an almost impregnable fortress. The position commanded the approaches to the island's northern airfield, making its capture essential for American success, but the cost in Marine casualties was horrific. The battle for Hell's Kitchen demonstrated the evolution of both American and Japanese tactics during the Pacific War. The Marines had learned to combine all available weapons systems in coordinated assaults, while the Japanese had abandoned the suicidal banzai charges of earlier campaigns in favor of methodical defensive warfare designed to maximize American casualties. By March 10th, the Marines had finally broken through the main Japanese defensive line, but at a cost that shocked even veteran commanders who had led troops through previous Pacific battles. The lesson of Hell's Kitchen was clear: victory on Iwo Jima would require the complete destruction of Kuribayashi's forces, as the Japanese had no intention of surrendering regardless of the tactical situation. March 15th brought the beginning of the final phase of the Iwo Jima campaign as the remaining Japanese defenders retreated to their last prepared positions in the island's northeastern sector. General Kuribayashi had established his final command post in a complex cave system near Katano Point, where the terrain offered the best remaining defensive positions on the increasingly conquered island. Lieutenant Colonel Justice Chambers led his 3rd Battalion, 25th Marines in the grueling advance across Iwo Jima's most broken terrain, where every volcanic ridge and depression had been converted into a defensive position. The Japanese had used their remaining time to create interlocking fields of fire that made frontal assault nearly impossible, forcing the Marines to develop new tactics for each individual strongpoint. Corporal James Bradley, a Navy hospital corpsman attached to the Marine Infantry, moved forward with the assault troops to provide immediate medical care for wounded Marines. The volcanic rocks still made it impossible to dig proper foxholes or establish protected aid stations, forcing medical personnel to work under fire while exposed to enemy observation. And direct fire weapons, "We've got wounded Marines in that crater," shouted Sergeant Robert Mueller, pointing toward a shell hole where 3 Marines lay pinned down by Japanese machine gun fire. The enemy position was perfectly sighted to prevent evacuation of the wounded men, creating the kind of tactical dilemma that characterized fighting throughout the Iwo Jima campaign. The sulphurous smoke rising from Mount Suribachi cast an ominous shadow over the invasion fleet as it approached the volcanic island of Iwo Jima on the morning of February 19, 1945. Marine Private First Class Tommy Rodriguez pressed his face against the cold steel of the landing craft, watching the distant shore grow larger through the gray dawn light. The black volcanic sand beaches ahead looked deceptively peaceful, but every man aboard knew they were sailing toward hell itself. Admiral Chester Nimitz had called this operation the most difficult and costly battle in Marine Corps' history, and as the massive naval bombardment thundered overhead, Rodriguez understood why. For 72 consecutive days, American warships had pounded the 8-square-mile island, yet intelligence reports suggested that General Tadamichi Kuribayashi's 22,000 Japanese defenders remained deeply entrenched in an elaborate network of caves, tunnels, and fortified positions. The first wave of Marines from the 4th and 5th Marine Divisions hit the beaches at 900 hours, their boots sinking into the strange volcanic sand that felt more like black snow than solid ground. Staff Sergeant Michael O'Brien led his squad of 12 men from the 28th Marine Regiment up the steep terraces, their hearts pounding as they expected the familiar crack of enemy rifle fire. Instead, an eerie silence greeted them, a silence more terrifying than any battle cry. "Something ain't right here, Sarge," whispered Corporal Jake Williams, his eyes scanning the seemingly empty landscape ahead. The absence of immediate resistance puzzled the Marines, who had grown accustomed to fierce opposition during their island-hopping campaign across the Pacific. Mount Suribachi loomed before them like a sleeping giant, its slopes honeycombed with invisible gun positions and observation posts. As recorded in the official Marine Corps' historical accounts, the Japanese strategy under Kuribayashi represented a dramatic departure from previous Pacific battles. Rather than launching costly banzai charges, the defenders would allow the Americans to advance inland before unleashing their fury from concealed positions. The general had transformed Iwo Jima into a fortress designed to extract maximum casualties from the advancing Marines. By 10:30 hours, nearly 30,000 Marines had stormed ashore across the invasion beaches. The volcanic sand made movement exhausting. Every step forward seemed to slide backward, and the lightweight volcanic rock provided little protection from incoming fire. Equipment bogged down in the unstable terrain, and medical corpsmen struggled to evacuate wounded Marines across the treacherous beaches. Suddenly, the silence shattered. Hidden artillery pieces, mortars, and machine guns opened fire simultaneously from concealed positions across the island. The carefully coordinated Japanese fire plan turned the black beaches into a killing field, with Marines diving for whatever cover they could find among the volcanic rocks and shell craters. The battle for Iwo Jima had truly begun, and both sides knew that only one would emerge victorious from this volcanic hell. The second day of the assault revealed the true horror of Kuribayashi's defensive strategy, as Marines encountered the intricate network of tunnels and fortifications that would earn Iwo Jima its grim nickname, the Meat Grinder. Lieutenant Colonel Chandler Johnson led his battalion of the 28th Marines in a brutal push toward Mount Suribachi's base, where every yard gained cost precious American lives. Sergeant Danny Murphy crawled forward through the volcanic ash, his squad following in single file as Japanese machine gun fire raked the ground above their heads. The enemy positions seemed to appear from nowhere. A seemingly empty patch of ground would suddenly erupt with deadly fire, then fall silent again as the defenders retreated deeper into their underground maze. "Contact! Front!" screamed Private Eddie Chen as a Japanese soldier emerged from a hidden spider hole, throwing a grenade toward the advancing Marines. The explosion showered the Americans with volcanic debris, but Chen's quick rifle shot dropped the enemy before he could disappear. Back underground, this deadly game of hide-and-seek characterized every engagement on Iwo Jima. where the traditional rules of warfare no longer applied. The Japanese had spent months preparing their defenses, digging an estimated 11 miles of tunnels connecting over 1,500 cave positions and concrete bunkers. Marine flamethrower teams became essential for clearing these positions, advancing under covering fire to reach close enough range to blast jets of burning fuel into the cave mouths. The psychological toll on these men was enormous, as they faced the most intimate and terrible form of combat. According to contemporary war correspondent Ernie Pyle's dispatches from the Pacific Theater, the Marines on Iwo Jima faced an enemy who fought from positions that were virtually invisible and seemingly impregnable. The volcanic rock proved nearly impossible to dig through, forcing Marines to seek cover in shell craters and behind the scattered equipment of fallen comrades. Captain Robert Hayes coordinated artillery strikes against suspected Japanese positions, but the enemy's deep underground positions rendered most indirect fire ineffective. The Marines would have to dig out each position individually, often at point-blank range. Naval gunfire support continued around the clock, with destroyers and cruisers firing into known cave mouths. But Kurabayashi's men simply retreated deeper into their volcanic fortress. By the end of the second day, American casualties had already exceeded projections for the entire operation. Medical corpsmen worked frantically to stabilize wounded Marines for evacuation to hospital ships offshore, but the black volcanic sand made stretcher movement exhausting work. The beaches remained under constant enemy observation and sporadic artillery fire, turning medical evacuation into another deadly challenge. The Marines pressed forward despite the horrific casualties, driven by their training, unit cohesion, and the knowledge that retreat was impossible. Every cave cleared, every bunker destroyed brought them one step closer to securing their strategic airfield that would save American bomber crews flying missions over Japan. The battle had become a test of wills between two determined fighting forces, with the volcanic island itself serving as an impartial witness to their mutual destruction. Dawn on February 23rd brought with it the most ambitious operation yet attempted on Iwo Jima, the direct assault on Mount Suribachi's heavily fortified slopes. Colonel Harry Liversedge's 28th Marine Regiment had spent 4 grueling days fighting through the southern sector of the island, and now they faced the challenge of scaling the 400-foot volcanic peak that dominated the entire battlefield. First Lieutenant Harold Schreier led the 40-man patrol that would attempt to reach Suribachi's summit, carrying with them a small American flag and the hopes of 30,000 Marines fighting below. The steep slopes were riddled with caves, tunnels, and concealed firing positions, each one potentially harboring Japanese defenders ready to fight to the death. Private First Class Ira Hayes, a Pima Indian from Arizona, moved cautiously up the volcanic rock face alongside his fellow Marines. The silence was unnerving after days of constant combat. The absence of enemy fire felt almost supernatural. Japanese artillery from other parts of the island could not effectively target the mountain slopes without hitting their own positions, creating an eerie pocket of relative calm in the midst of the larger battle. Sergeant Michael Strank, a veteran of previous Pacific campaigns, led his squad through a maze of sulfur-stained rocks and steaming fissures that reminded the Marines they were climbing an active volcano. The acrid smell of sulfur mixed with the ever-present odor of death and curdite, creating an atmosphere that seemed lifted from Dante's vision of hell itself. As the patrol neared the summit, they encountered scattered resistance from Japanese soldiers who had been cut off from their main defensive positions. These isolated defenders fought with desperate courage, knowing that their island fortress was slowly being consumed by the American advance. Hand-to-hand combat erupted among the volcanic rocks, as Marines cleared each cave and crevice with grenades, rifle fire, and fixed bayonets. The moment that would define the battle came at 10:20 hours, when Schreier's patrol finally reached Suribachi's crater rim. Working together, several Marines raised the small American flag on a piece of Japanese pipe, creating an image that electrified the Marines fighting below and watching from ships offshore. The sight of Old Glory flying over the volcanic peak provided a powerful psychological boost to American morale. Even though the majority of the island remained in enemy hands, As documented in official Marine Corps records and numerous eyewitness accounts, a second flag raising occurred later that afternoon when a larger flag was substituted for the original. Associated Press photographer Joe Rosenthal captured this second raising in what would become the most famous photograph of World War II. Though the Marines involved had no idea, they were participating in a moment that would be remembered for generations. The Japanese defenders, now reduced to fewer than 3,000 effective fighters, continued to exact a terrible price for every yard of ground surrendered. Kurabayashi's leadership had maintained unit cohesion and fighting effectiveness despite weeks of continuous combat and the gradual destruction of his defensive positions. Throughout the island, Marine engineers worked frantically to clear lanes through Japanese minefields and construct roads capable of supporting tanks and artillery. Across the volcanic terrain, the unique characteristics of Iwo Jima's volcanic soil had made conventional military engineering extremely difficult, requiring innovative solutions to problems that had never been encountered in previous Pacific campaigns, according to classified intelligence reports declassified decades after the war. American code breakers had intercepted Japanese communications, revealing the desperate situation facing Kurabayashi's remaining forces. However, this intelligence advantage provided little tactical benefit, as the Japanese continued fighting with undiminished determination, regardless of their strategic situation. First Lieutenant Charles Lindbergh coordinated the final artillery bombardment against known Japanese positions, using direct fire from tanks and artillery pieces positioned at point-blank range. The volcanic rock absorbed much of the explosive effect from conventional shells, requiring massive concentrations of firepower to achieve results that would have been routine on other battlefields. The psychological pressure on Marines reaching the end of the campaign was enormous. Men who had survived weeks of the most intense combat in Pacific War history faced the knowledge that they might be killed or wounded in the final days of a battle that was already clearly won. The random nature of combat casualties meant that survival often depended more on luck than skill or courage. By March 20th, organized Japanese resistance had collapsed except for isolated pockets of defenders who continued fighting from individual cave positions. The transition from large unit combat to small-scale mop-up operations created new dangers, as individual Japanese soldiers and small groups continued to pose threats to unwary Marines throughout the conquered portions of the island. March 26, 1945 marked the official end of organized resistance on Iwo Jima. Those scattered Japanese holdouts would continue fighting for several more days, from individual cave positions scattered across the conquered island. The final battle statistics revealed the true cost of this volcanic hell: over 28,000 American casualties, including nearly 7,000 dead, against a Japanese garrison that had been virtually annihilated. General Tadamichi Kurabayashi made his final stand from a cave complex near Kitano Point, where he had established his last command post as American forces closed in from all directions. Rather than surrender, the Japanese commander chose to lead a final attack against Marine positions, dying as he had lived throughout the campaign, fighting to extract maximum casualties from his American opponents. Major General Harry Schmidt, commanding the 5th Amphibious Corps, walked across the battlefield where so many of his Marines had fallen during 36 days of the most intense combat in Marine Corps history. The volcanic landscape remained scarred by countless shell craters, destroyed equipment, and the improvised graves of men who had died far from home in service to their country. Private First Class Jacqueline Lucas, who had earned the Medal of Honor by throwing himself on Japanese grenades to save his fellow Marines, represented the extraordinary courage displayed by ordinary Americans throughout the campaign. The Congressional Medal of Honor would be awarded to 27 men for their actions on Iwo Jima, a number that reflected the exceptional nature of this battle. Even by World War II standards, the strategic value of Iwo Jima became apparent in the months following its capture, as American B-29 Superfortress bombers used the island's airfields for emergency landings. During missions over Japan, military historians estimate that over 24,000 American aircrew members were saved. by having Iwo Jima available as an emergency landing site, a number that exceeded the American casualties suffered during the battle itself. Navy Hospital Corpsman John Bradley and the other survivors of the famous flag-raising photograph found themselves reluctant celebrities upon returning to the United States for war bond drives. The image of 6 Americans raising Old Glory over Mount Suribachi had become the defining symbol of American determination and sacrifice during World War II, though the men involved remained modest about their role in history. As recorded in official post-war historical assessments and veteran interviews conducted decades later, the Battle of Iwo Jima represented a turning point in American understanding of what invasion of the Japanese home islands would cost. The fanatical resistance encountered on this small volcanic island influenced American decision-making regarding the use of atomic weapons and the planned Operation Downfall invasion of Japan. The volcanic island of Iwo Jima stands today as a monument to the courage and sacrifice of both American and Japanese forces who fought there during those terrible 36 days in early 1945. The black volcanic sand beaches where Marines first landed remain largely unchanged, serving as a permanent reminder of the price paid by young men who answered their nation's call to duty in humanity's greatest conflict. The lesson of Iwo Jima endures in American military doctrine and national memory, that free societies sometimes must pay terrible prices to preserve their values, and that ordinary citizens are capable of extraordinary heroism when faced with existential challenges. The Marines who fought through this volcanic hell earned their place in American history through blood, courage, and an unwavering commitment to their mission and their brothers in arms.